Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it. Hi, everybody. Welcome. It's our Wednesday webinar. I'm happy to be back. I can't keep up with my own schedule. I was somewhere else last week, but I'm here anyway. That's what counts. So yeah.
You were in training last week.
That's right. Right. Thank you. God. I was on another webinar today, and I'm really, really busy right now. And the woman was saying, because we're all working at home, we all have the misconception that we have time, but it's a very different way of working. Our schedules kind of creep up and get full, and it can be overwhelming sometimes. Anyway, tonight I want to talk a little about this. And again, these topics always kind of come up in different contexts in my life. And so with clients and with former clients and with friends, and the subject of empathy has come up. And that's always a big topic with our own clients in terms of reestablishing empathy, which when we're in that addictive phase, we kind of lose our ability to empathize with people. I think people honestly generally don't have an understanding of the impact that some of their behaviors have. They're just not in touch with it. And it can be kind of a devastating thing when that connection is finally made, often in treatment. But I want to talk a little bit about what it is and maybe how we can take some steps to start to restore it. Empathy, like resilience, is not one of those character traits that we either have or we don't. Empathy is a skill, and it's a skill that all of us can learn and practice and get better at. And so I think that's really important to be aware of. But literally, what is empathy? It's the ability to step into somebody's shoes and literally feel what they're feeling. And we as human beings are really hardwired to be able to do this. We have mirror neurons, we have these empathy circuitry that's been identified in our brains in the last 10 years that kind of is the neuro wiring and neurochemistry that helps us really relate. And I think we as human beings have a much greater ability to have empathy than we're even in touch with or able to utilize. So empathy is that ability to really understand someone, their perspectives, and to guide our behavior as a result of that. It's not kindness, it's not pity, it's not do unto others, but it's really a sense of being with someone emotionally, really getting a sense of what we can do. And so, we're really primed for empathy in the first 2 years of life is really important, where we learn how to attach to people, how to connect with people. We connect first with our mothers typically, and our fathers and other people in our lives. And if those attachments are disrupted, as they often are with addiction, either through neglect or through trauma of some sort or some adverse experience, it can really have an impact on the ability to grow up with empathy. So there is this kind of component that as we're raised, but what does that do? It allows us to attach to people, to develop intimacy, to have social cooperation for mutual aid. And it really enables us to function as a society and a community, and that's really incredibly important. There was an interesting study I came across that looked at the habits of highly empathetic people. And what do? There were 4 of them they identified. One was they cultivate curiosity about strangers. They're not judgmental, but they're curious. And so these are the people that will, start a conversation with a stranger that sitting next to them at Starbucks, or God forbid on an airplane if we ever fly again, get one of those chatty people that want to know everything next to you. But that's one thing, to have curiosity about strangers. The second was to challenge prejudices and discover commonalities. So really this is some bit of self-work. What are my prejudices? What are my thoughts and beliefs or preconceptions? And to really kind of not be trapped by those and allow us to move beyond them. To try another person's life. I think there's a lot of expressions about the benefits of travel. And having done some international travel myself and lived overseas, I can really say there's nothing like that to really kind of broaden your range of experience and shatter kind of norms and to really broaden one's life. And then finally, is to just listen, to be really good listeners. I think that's a critical piece of this, is to just really hear and observe and be attached to someone when they're speaking or communicating through active listening, where we're really there and we can be present. So those are kind of the feel of what we're looking for. A couple of specific concrete steps to talk about. One is to develop empathy. One is to experience differences among people, just to really kind of celebrate diversity, celebrate variation, celebrate the fact that somebody may have a different way of looking at things than you do. And I know these days with being so polarized, that's a tricky subject area even, but I think it's really important to kind of have a broad openness about that. And then second, some inside work to really learn how to identify your own feelings. If we don't have a sense of what we're feeling, it's going to be really hard to make sense of what somebody else is feeling. And so I think we have to really be aware of what we are feeling, and some of the barriers we see to that. Oftentimes if I'll ask a client, well, what do you feel about that? And if the response is, well, I think that, that's not a feeling, right? That's a thought. And we may not, sometimes we have to kind of distinguish between related emotions, like happiness or excitement. They're two different things. And so to really kind of get a fine tuning on our own feeling before we can really connect with somebody. And then, regularly ask people about their perspectives. And I make a point of almost playing a little game with myself, sort of thinking, well, what do I think this person is going to feel about that? Or how are they going to react to this? And then I ask. And sometimes my perceptions are right, sometimes they're way off base. But I think to really kind of be actively thinking about this stuff and what might that person be feeling. So I think, empathy is a topic that is a huge thing right now. There's a general fear among social scientists that we're kind of losing empathy. And I think we don't know yet the impact of technology, and certainly the impact of COVID and coronavirus and how it kind of having been dropped into isolation for 6 months now. It's going to have some kind of impact. But I think we have to really consciously work at being connected with each other. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Get your questions in, ask in the Q&A, and we'll get to them. I did come up with a couple while you were talking, David. Can you explain what exactly mirror neurons are and how they work? I mean, they're kind of what they sound like, but it may have,
Yeah, so we've known for a while that we're kind of hardwired for empathy. So we have the ability that's connected to our senses in our brains, these circuits. And actually in the last 10 years, they've started to really identify specific points and sort of circuitry in the brain. But it's this capability to pick up on somebody else by observing them. That's not just the visuals, but it uses all our senses, including intuition. And I think it's that ability to use our imagination that we have as human beings, and that sense of emotional content, and to really sort of pick up on it. But it's actually physical connections in our brains that in ways that we don't totally understand, to be honest, but that kind of lay the groundwork for our ability to perceive in a way that other animals don't. And it's a really kind of higher, more evolved kind of ability.
So, thank you. And the mirror neurons, my understanding is some of the research, like even if you're like testing a human with the monkey, like if the human cocks the head and, sort of interacts with the monkey will also cock its head and interact. I mean, is that sort of mirror neurons in play? Like we're really connecting with each other?
Very much so. And it's interesting, it can happen cross species, right? But that does happen. And, interesting, I was mentioning the importance of being a good listener, an active listener. Part of that is sometimes mirroring body language. And so when you're training to become a therapist, they actually talk about that, how to kind of mirror body language and make people more comfortable. But if you notice when you're having a conversation with somebody, if you're really engaged, if someone, leans forward, you may lean forward. If somebody, puts their hand in their lap, you may find yourself putting your hand in your lap. It's kind of this nonverbal way of expressing this connection and attunement that we have to each other.
Yeah, and that's actually what I was going to, ask you about was active listening. Certainly mirroring with the body. What are some other signs of active listening, or ways we can put effort into active listening?
Right. So yeah, active listening is just incredibly important. So that mirroring the body language is one. I think just kind of occasionally, just something like nodding your head, to show you're connected. Sometimes giving a phrase back, gee, so I hear you say that, this was a really bad day for you. Or so, just affirming what's being said. And the other thing that we teach a lot of couples to do with communication is really checking things out. So I heard you say that, you're really upset about X, Y, Z. Do I have that right? Is Is that what you're saying? And so just kind of verifying. And the other thing about active listening, I think sometimes to be helpful, we think we have to fix something or supply us a problem, an answer or a solution. And I think oftentimes people just want to be heard. They just want to be witnessed. And I think, and sometimes I'll even ask, I'll empathize, I'll say, I'm sorry. So would you like feedback? Do you want to hear from me or not? Sometimes people don't. And the other big mistake I've seen people make is to inject themselves into the process. So if somebody's telling some story that they've had a bad time with, what you don't want to do is saying, boy, I know, let me tell you about the time I had this issue, and suddenly it's all about me. And you want to be really conscious of that too. So it's a matter of just being sensitive, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. You also mentioned, I have two more questions, and then we'll go to the Q&A. You mentioned that we kind of learn empathy, hopefully, in the first 2 years of life. Now, I know when I was, a little kid, after I had been born, my mother was reading Dr. Spock's book, which said, don't coddle your babies. If you coddle especially boys, you're going to have a bunch of needy little sissy boys. If you respond to them when they cry and do things like that. I think a lot of people, especially men of my generation, we didn't really get that empathy because our mothers were told, no, don't do that. It's a bad thing. Am I off base? Do you see this?
Yeah, and I had the same cultural era. So yeah, I think that's totally true. There's been some unfortunate data that came in after the fall of the Soviet Union with in Eastern Europe, where everything kind of got very disorganized. There were a lot of orphans, and a lot of orphans in these Eastern European orphanages where the babies weren't held, they weren't coddled, they were just kind of changed and left in their cribs unattended, basically. And they grew up with all kinds of personality disorders and conduct disorders and sociopathy, and just this ability that everything was screwy about their ability to attach to people and develop intimacy and any kind of normal connection to other people. So that is vital. But in a less dramatic situation, I think in situations like this, the kids that were influenced by Dr. Spock, I think it does impact how people, especially I think how men, interact with each other. I think we're getting a greater awareness of it now. I think there's a real rigidity in male roles and what it means to be a man and all that stuff that I think is probably reflected as kind of a less soft, interactive kind of way to be, but more kind of rigid and independent and disconnected. So I think it plays out. And I think that, again, that can be corrected, but it takes some work as adults. And oftentimes, we get detoured by addiction, but in recovery, a lot of this work can be done as well.
Yeah, there's a real kind of perception, I think, that men are just not very good at empathy and women are sort of naturally good at empathy. Is that because of the way we're wired, or is that because of the way we're taught?
I think it's a little bit of both. We know that women are much more relational, meaning that they value the process of relationships, and they're more communicative and I think, frankly, more in touch with their emotions. Men physiologically are a little different in that we're less relational and more kind of transactional and visual. And I think we're slightly different wiring. However, for many thousands of years, it's worked, I think, with those two kind of physiological situations where we cooperate and have successful bonding and intimacy and so on. So I think a lot of it is the cultural imposition of some of these beliefs that I think, fortunately, are kind of breaking apart now. And there's much more flexibility in gender roles and that kind of thing for people.
Yeah. So what happens when addiction comes along? What happens to empathy?
Well, addiction is really hard on empathy. So especially the addictions that we treat at Seeking Integrity, with a sex addiction and porn addiction and chemsex, which all operate very, very similarly in the brain and in the real world. All those addictions are really characterized by this process of objectifying other people. And really that objectifying is really kind of the opposite of empathy, where people are literally kind of made into objects, often very highly sexualized, down to the point of sometimes really looking at somebody at body parts, not just as a whole person. And so I think once we sort of dehumanize like that, and it sounds like a harsh way of doing it, but that's really kind of what's happening. We dehumanize other people and objectify them. It's very hard to have empathy for them. I think what scares me about the world these days is that there's that whole dehumanizing force about other cultures and other people and races, and I think that also just widens the gulf between people and their understanding.
Yeah, in the last session of the work group that I teach, by the way, we have a new one starting on Saturday. It's our level 1 work group for male sex and porn addicts. It's a great way to get started in recovery. That's not why I brought this up, but I'll plug it while I'm talking about it. In the work group, one of the guys was talking about objectifying his wife. He said he was using his wife to act out, and he said, I felt like I was cheating on my wife with my wife's body parts, because he had completely removed her humanity from this person that he's married to and loves and cares about, which I found that was like, wow, that's there's a real lack of empathy there, or a real ability to avoid feeling empathy, so that you can objectify someone that you truly actually care about.
Right. And it's not just behavioral. I mean, some of this is chemical. There's I do a lot of work, as you know, with methamphetamine, and this, again, that works very similar to porn and sex addiction. But a lot of the significant amount of the child abuse in rural parts of America, where there's a high amount of methamphetamine among heterosexual parents, they get basically disconnected from their children. I've read statistics up to a third of child abuse is directly related to this kind of dehumanizing of their own children. They get disconnected emotionally, and so there's a lot of people feel freer to do kind of corporal punishment and that kind of stuff, or neglect, because they're not quite human. And it's kind of terrifying, actually.
Yeah. Thank you for humoring my questions about empathy. I love that topic. So let's get to our questions. We've got a bunch of them in here. And feel free to type more in if you've got questions. Discovery happened on June 9th. Disclosure, which is a therapeutic disclosure where the addict comes clean about everything, happened October 3rd. There was a polygraph. The addict states that transsexuals are part of the progression only. So this is somebody who was acting out with transsexuals as part of the addiction. He says he's heterosexual. He wants to stay married. He's doing all the work. He was eager for disclosure, says there's no sexual abuse in his history. States that emotional neglect is possibly the cause. And I think this continues here. My highly trained CSAT sees symbolism to two things: is transsexual escorts / porn template and specific dates to acting out. On Mother's Day, he had a female escort. On wedding anniversary and bachelor party, there were trans escorts. Drinking occurred only at bachelor party. Drinking runs in the family. Any thoughts on that, David? First of all, men acting out with other men or transsexuals, how often do we see that? Is that fairly normal? What does it indicate? What does it not indicate? All of that good stuff. And how does substances play into that?
Right. I don't see that question here, but I heard it and listened to it. So yeah, it's something we do see. There's a couple things going on there, I think. One is that with the sexual acting out and with pornography too, in terms of just taste, what kind of porn people are looking at, there's an escalation, meaning that with dopamine that causes the rush of the good feelings, that very quickly gets accustomed to whatever the input is. And so we have to kind of up the ante with kinkier images or behaviors, or more taboo or rougher, or whatever it takes to kind of get a little more stimulation for the dopamine. So very quickly, people kind of drift off into these sometimes very dark fantasies or scenarios, and sometimes out of their kind of normal attractions. And so we've had over the course of my career, I've had quite a number of heterosexually identified guys who, when they started acting out, often with methamphetamine, would act out with transgendered individuals, and so that isn't that unusual. But what does that mean? So what we don't want to do is confuse the attraction with the addiction, right? The addiction is not about it's not about the who. It's not about who we're attracted to. And so sometimes people feel that if they can get their sex addiction under control, this particular attraction is going to kind of go away. And the general feeling is that a lot of these attractions can get kind of a little bit morphed and amplified by some of the drug behavior, but oftentimes that particular attraction was probably there and wasn't uncovered earlier. We have in our arousal template, we have a diversity of different kinds of attractions, most of which for the rest of our lives will probably remain buried and we never connect with. But something like porn and sex addiction, where people are looking at so many different images and behaviors and kinky things and different kinds of transgender people and just all kinds of stuff, sometimes that gets kind of awakened. And so a couple takeaways then. One is that probably was there all along, but just buried under everything else. Two, addiction, getting yourself abstinent and in a program is not going to really necessarily remove that from your arousal template. And three, what does that mean? So there's a lot of couples that work on this. A lot of guys say, well, if I'm in recovery, I don't really have the urge to go down that road. So I'm just not going to activate that. I'm going to, spend my time with my wife and we're going to work on our relationship. Other couples decide that they want more flexibility, and they may work out some kind of guidelines or rules for people kind of having more of an open relationship. That's really slippery slope stuff for me if you're a sex addict. So I don't recommend that at all. And some people decide that it's not going to work. So, it really is one of those things that I think takes a lot of guidance from therapists, from some help. And I really encourage people, remember when we get clean and sober. Now sounds like it's been a while from the timeline that was read, but when we first get into recovery, we are really works in progress. And so I always tell people, don't make a decision based on where you're feeling today, because in 90 days, you're going to be feeling differently, and in 6 months, different again, in a year, totally different. So just kind of, I think it's important to kind of roll with the process and just see where things start to settle out.
Yeah, sexual orientation, it exists on a spectrum from, completely 100% gay to completely 100% straight. And most people are not at the end point of that line, one endpoint or the other. Most people are somewhere in the middle. So, you can identify as heterosexual with a little bit of a latent attraction and still say, I'm straight. May not be 100% straight, you might be 95% straight. Some people are all over the spectrum. As David said, porn, I know Dr. Rob wrote a blog, I think it's on Psychology Today, looking at what porn can do to an arousal template. And his conclusion is porn can uncover latent elements of an arousal template that might otherwise never be uncovered, by the way, but it can't uncover something that's not there. I am one of those weird people that is at the far end of the orientation spectrum. I am 100% gay. You could show me porn of women from now until the end of time, and I am not going to be physically attracted to women because it's just not part of my arousal template. Trust me, I tried when I was a teenager. I really did. And it didn't work.
Most gay men tried it. Yeah, really.
Yeah, we tried. I tried so hard. But most people are somewhere in, I just want you to say, what I want to say is don't lose hope or think that, he's gay because he had sex with a transsexual. It really doesn't mean all that much. If it's his primary attraction, that means something. But if women are his primary attraction, he's probably mostly straight. And that's enough for a typical marriage, as long as he can stay sober in his addiction.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And I have looked for a support group for that particular population, and there's nothing out there. There really needs to be one. We've actually
We should probably start a drop-in group or something.
we've thought about it because it's not an unusual phenomenon.
Yeah.
And from young men to older men, it happens. A certain percentage of guys fall into that category for sure.
Yeah. So, and as far as, especially with drinking disinhibits. It's just going to make it easier to do things that he might otherwise want to repress or not do, or just to make plain old bad decisions, like I'm going to cheat, which is just a really bad decision, no matter who you're doing it with. So, yeah. And David touched on meth. I mean, you talked about drinking, but yeah, meth is a really bad decision maker.
Yeah, and of all the drugs, I think methamphetamine is the most destructive in that regard, because it can lead people down into really dark places and fantasies, and to the point where I've had guys, and once they got into recovery, were really kind of traumatized by by what they had found sexually attractive when they're in their disease. It's really bizarre stuff that it's like, did that come out of my head? Who am I really? And part of that's just the distortion of meth. But I think these basic elements about sexual attraction to orientation is really kind of more hardwired in there.
Yeah. Yeah, and guys with meth, as they get desensitized to sex, even though it feels like meth heightens the arousal, they sort of become sexually desensitized. So they keep escalating the nature of the behavior, and they end up doing things that are often dangerous, or
Extremely so. Yeah.
Okay, this is from a betrayed partner. The gaslighting and verbal abuse became so bad that I filed for divorce. My spouse refused to leave the house. It was no good for the children. What advice can you give for someone who wants to heal despite divorcing the spouse who refuses to get recovery? So you've got a betrayed partner who is divorcing or has divorced, I'm not sure which, out of the house, still wants to heal, and the cheater is not. So thoughts?
That's a tough situation. I'm sorry that is happening in your life. I think it's really important. I really admire your attitude. I think it's a really important one, is to not let the damage continue. Because I think in my experience, when this occurs, when there's betrayal and verbal abuse, let alone that just amplifies and makes it bad, and the gaslighting, all that stuff that's so painful and really traumatic in many ways, if that continues, that causes damage, basically. That does harm. And even if the marriage ends, if that person goes away, you never see them again, there's some impact on the family, an impact on the partner that needs to be addressed. And I think it's really important for you to have support, have a CSAT, particularly, who understands partner trauma and what's going on, that would do your work. And in the spirit of prodependence, this is not because there's something wrong with you, but it's because you have had this experience that anybody in that situation would want to process that and deal with it, and see how you can grow and be even more resilient coming out of that marriage. But frankly, it sounds like there's some resilience there anyway, because sometimes making those tough decisions and setting a boundary and really living with it, despite that's never easy emotionally or financially or physically. So good for you. And I think it's important. Those are critical boundaries. And frankly, in a situation like that, I don't know that it ever gets better unless something changes like that. So I would just make sure that you have the support you need to do the work, any work you need to do to move past this and heal. And
don't look at it as I have to, or I need to. Look at it as I deserve to get the support, because you do deserve to get support for what you've gone through, and what you're still going through, probably. So kudos for being here and speaking up.
Yeah,
big time.
sure.
I love this next one. Any recommendations for coping with emotional distress during the presidential election? It has been difficult to exercise empathy with others who do not share my political beliefs. I fear that anxiety and anger will become overwhelming as we get closer to the election. You got in my head and pried that question out. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally share every word you just said there. I think we're all feeling it. I think we have the cumulative stress of coronavirus and the impact that's had on our lives and our finances and everything. You know, kids still working from home and having kids doing homeschooling and just the disruption, plus the really charged political atmosphere, I think is really one of the more, if not the most painful times I've ever gone through. I've gone through some pretty crappy times with the AIDS crisis and other stuff. So yeah, it's a really hard time. And I think self-care is what it's all about right now. And that for me, I'll just tell you what I'm doing is really limiting uh, television in terms of news. I scan the paper once a day to kind of stay informed, but I have friends who it's kind of like fatal attraction that are staring at a car accident, they can't tear themselves away from the news. And it's really bad for us. It just sets off a whole fight or flight kind of panic response that just aggravates it. But beyond that is what you're describing to where we are so polarized that that's one of the reasons I want to talk about empathy tonight, because it's really hard to generate empathy right now for people that I have strong feelings about, and I do. You know, I think all of us do, and so it's difficult now. So I'm trying to really practice kindness and empathy and trying to understand, because I know that's where healing comes out of that. Healing comes out of some kind of bridges, but it's really hard right now. So honestly, between now and the election, I'm just kind of holding my breath and laying low and staying busy, too busy probably with work and doing my meditation and taking care of myself and staying connected and trying to live a day at a time. And I'm not even allowing myself to think past the election with whatever might happen. So yeah, I mean, it's really a tough time. I think empathy and it's just really in short supply right now. And I think, and I know why, it feels really hard. So I think take care of ourselves and just take care of each other as best we can. I think it still means a lot to have little acts of kindness. I really do believe in service and in putting good energy out in the world. And I'm trying to do that how I can every day. And I encourage everybody to try to do a little bit of that each day too. It seems sometimes like a tiny dot of energy in the face of this tsunami, but it's what we can do. I'll speak for myself. It's what I can do. I'll try to do.
Yeah, I agree totally. I've just had to turn the TV off, and you know, I know what's going on. I've made up my mind who I'm voting for. I don't need to follow it anymore. I just need to cast my vote, and then I'll be fine. And I have to work very hard at letting other people have their opinion, which is not so easy for me when I know they're wrong. But you know, I have to let people believe what they want to believe and vote how they want to vote. They have that right, just like I have my right to believe and vote the way I want to. But it's really tough in something as vitriolic as what whatever side of the fence you're on. It's nasty both ways. It's just not pleasant. Yeah, the only tip I have is turn that TV off, you know, or watch you know, Netflix only or something. I don't know. Okay, I'm gonna take this next question out of the chat feature. I feel as if this is from an addict. I feel as if I'm overly empathetic to a fault. I often overlook my own boundaries for the needs of others. Often this was the source for my addiction, as I justified being flirtatious based on someone else's needs. I've struggled with this my whole life, and it teeters between this situation where I'm wanting to be there for someone, if only in the moment, and the feeling I get from it. Does this make sense? So when I'm being objectified, I feel the need for the third party. I know damn well I shouldn't entertain it, then I get stuck in the cycle because it's obviously exciting. Does this make sense at all?
So from what I'm reading here is that there's a sort of being empathetic, being really connecting to what other people want as a way of getting validated. I think that's what is going on here. Let me just speak to a couple of pieces of this. One is there is such a thing as, I think, being overly empathetic, right? So we can we can fall out of ourselves. And this is very common for kids who grew up in any kind of dysfunctional family, especially addicted families, where oftentimes those kids are taught that they don't have needs, they don't have feelings. I actually had a cousin whose mother basically told her, dear, you're having feelings. You better go to your room. It's like, we don't do feelings in this house. Just that that kind of disconnect. So, but in any kind of dysfunctional household, we're so hyper vigilant and attuned to what's going on that we start to get overly invested in everybody else's feelings, and we lose touch with our own. So that is a problem if it gets out of balance. Empathy is all about this balance between knowing our own feelings and knowing or trying to identify the other person's feelings. But if we get overly invested in that person's feelings at the expense of our own, then it gets out of balance, and we can start to lose track of our needs and our wants. And when that combines, as I think in this case, with validation and sexual addiction, it gets really complicated, because we start to, first of all, everything gets kind of sexualized. Typically, it's very transactional, and people are viewed in very objectified ways as sex objects, and everything kind of gets sexualized at a very basic level. So I think the other thing I've seen with a lot of the guys I work with is getting overly invested in what other people think. And I think this is an epidemic, by the way, these days, where we're so, with all the apps, whether it's gay or straight, we create these profiles that are kind of our ideal selves. Even Facebook, by the way, Facebook is a whole constructed identity, right? It's the best side of ourselves, our fabulous vacations and our wonderful cars and our beautiful children. And, nobody posts, well, some people post, the terrible accident they had from the ER, which I really don't want to see either. But I think we create this false narrative about our lives and sometimes that gets overlaid with sexuality and validation. So yeah, I think it's really important. I think the kind of way out of this, from what I can see just briefly, is to really start getting in touch with your own feelings and start to pull back a little bit from being so invested in what other people are thinking and feeling. And that probably is driven, in my experience, by our self-worth gets connected to what you think of me. And part of that's just human nature, but if that gets out of balance, that can be a real problem for us.
So as a sex addict who works with a lot of sex addicts, although David does too, but he's not a sex addict, and I am going to be a little less nice than he is, than he just was. So bear with me. I have someone that I work with here in the desert, and we got to dinner fairly often, not so much recently, although the restaurants did just open up here again. But he's always really, really nice to the waitress. And I point out that you're always really, really nice to the waitress. And he says, well, I'm just being nice and I want her to feel like she's doing a good job and blah, blah, blah. And I said, yeah, but you never do that with the waiter, do you? He is using his niceness as part of his denial. It's okay for me to flirt with the waitress because I'm just being nice. And I hear I'm overly empathetic to a fault, and my little BS alarm is going, no, you're not. You're acting out. This is what I make up in my head, because I know that if this came out of my mouth or I had typed this in, this is what I would be doing, which is I'm justifying my behavior. I'm just a really empathetic person, and she's made eye contact with me, and I need to make eye contact back and be there with her. And you know what? Guess what? You're a sex addict. You don't get to do that anymore. I'm sorry, but you don't get to do that anymore. And I know who asked this question. I love you. I really do. But my little alarm is going off, going, that's part of your denial. It's part of your addiction. And I'm not saying you don't have a lot of empathy. We can take our good traits and use them to justify, we will justify our addiction any way we can do it. So yeah, that's what I'm hearing there. So yeah, I did warn you I wasn't going to be as nice as David. Sorry.
Good. Well, thanks. Thanks, Scott.
So, okay, let's go back to our Q&A. And yes, there is some empathy there, but you're using it. You're using it to further your addiction. That's what I hear and what I see. As the addict, I understand needing to be an active listener and being more empathetic to my wife, but sometimes it seems hard when my wife keeps on shaming me and always saying things will never get better, etc. Shouldn't a betrayed spouse at some point begin to learn how to live life with an addict in a healthy way, and stop shaming me when I'm trying to work on myself, and shaming me when I'm trying to work on myself doesn't seem helpful. I just wonder what this is supposed to look like. That's a very good question.
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think this is a very common dynamic that we see, where there's still a lot of pain and anger and resentment and distrust, even though the addict has started to move into recovery. And I think finding your way through those waters can be really tricky sometimes. And I think I believe the best kind of trajectory is for both the addict and the partner to have their own therapy and their own work early on, and really not try to do too much together. Now, obviously, you're sharing a house, you're living together, you're raising kids, and all that, and so there's got to be some interaction. But I think there also should be some boundaries. And an addict is going to come home and have boundaries on his or her behavior. And I think to some extent, the partner, it's incumbent on them as well to have some kind of boundaries about shaming, certainly, and some of the critical talk. I mean, if I were a couples therapist in this situation, I'd really encourage people to have some boundaries about what kind of feedback they give, to have it very structured when they do interact like that with feedback, and to have real clear guidelines of what's acceptable and what's not. And the other thing I want to hear is what to you seems shaming. And sometimes we can hear flavors and feelings in something that either isn't intended or isn't really what's being said. And so sometimes the communication gets a little garbled, but assuming that there is some shaming there, I think that really does need to be put in check, and with some just guidelines about how to talk and communicate that's helpful. Because what happens in the situation is, when there's a lot of pain on both sides, I think especially the partner often has a lot of pain, and that leads to resentment. And then the addict gets resentful about some of the comments. And so we're starting to get back in a bad cycle. So I think really, when we have our clients talk to their families, we talk about news, weather, sports. People probably don't stick to that as much as we'd like, but basically it's really hard to get into some of these heavy duty discussions early on, and especially without support. And by support, I mean like a third person in the room, a therapist. These are difficult conversations, and couples, by the time they have a crisis and where one is moving into recovery, they're so entrenched in their patterns of usually arguing and assumptions and distrust, and you're flying in this kind of reactive mode as opposed to really effectively talking to each other and listening. And so I think to slow it down, each of you do your own kind of work and have some professional help you set up some kind of guidelines for how to interact with each other in a way that is most helpful as opposed to hurtful.
Yeah, and recovery, especially the first, really the first full year and maybe a little longer, it's 2 steps forward and 1 3/4 steps back, and 2 steps. It's this stop and start, up and down, back and forth, not only for you but for your partner. And you're trying to re-earn trust, and you're working on yourself, and you want this validation. And I'm just going to assume you're a male and she's a female. And she's not giving it to you because maybe she's not in the mood right at that moment, or maybe she's mad at you about something right at that moment, or maybe she's just not there yet. And I would advise you to seek your attaboys and your kudos from your sponsor and your buddies in recovery, because your spouse is on a roller coaster. 1 minute she's going to be really happy with you and really love you, and 2 minutes later, she's not going to want to be in the same room with you. For no apparent reason to you. I mean, something will trigger that change for her, and she'll probably know what it is, but maybe not. She'll just know that 2 minutes ago she loved you and now she hates you. And that's normal. And you're on a roller coaster too. I'm so happy to be in recovery. I really want to make it work. And 2 minutes later, you're like, oh, F this, so you're on a roller coaster, she's on a roller coaster, it's not the same roller coaster, sorry. And, turning to the person that you just hurt by cheating for an attaboy because you're no longer cheating is just a bad idea. Because you're just doing what you promised now by not cheating. You're doing what you promised when you got married. You promised to be faithful, I'm assuming. I wasn't there for the wedding vows, but expecting her to give you a pat on the back because you're finally behaving like the man she thought she married, that's going to be a long time coming. So now, as far as her shaming you or saying things that feel shaming to you, I think David addressed that, but yeah, I mean, she may not be trying to shame you, but saying things that are triggering your internalized shame, and she may not be trying. She may be trying to be nice to you and trigger shame. It happens. So yeah, having a mediator, a third party, a therapist. I put our respectful conflict agreement, a link to that in the chat feature. That can help in difficult conversations. I think I got that from Paul Hartman, who's a couples therapist.
And I really just want to underscore what you just said, Scott, because it's so important, and that's where do we get validation for the addict? Get validation from your peers, right? That's where it needs to come from. Totally.
So, okay, next one here. And we'll probably have time for one more after this if somebody wants to type one in real quick. How does one get through 90 days of abstinence when there's shame of having started and failed countless times? I started recovery a year ago with an intensive clinical workshop. Recovery has included 12-step meetings, individual and group therapy, EMDR, which is a form of trauma therapy, nutrition coaching, education through books, webinars, podcasts. I've cut contact with my qualifier for 6+ months, but currently that is the only bottom line I am not crossing. Okay, I've become comfortable again with using porn, masturbation, and fantasy to cope with boredom, stress, and depression. I have been out of work for months and no longer have the structure and distraction of going to an office every day. And you're not alone with, people out of work are relapsing left and right in all addictions. People still working are relapsing left and right with all addictions. It's a very stressful time we live in, and people do want to escape. So thoughts, David?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I see a lot, especially with methamphetamine, which there's this relapse syndrome that goes with it. And part of it is just the brain healing, and there's a lot of impulsivity and not much impulse control. And the same, I think, is true with sex addiction to a great extent. And so our brains are kind of on fire with triggers and cues and cravings, and we don't have many defenses except working that basic program. And that can, plus there's this kind of low-grade depression that's going on that makes everything kind of that much harder. So I understand the shame of that, picking up, white chip, if you do that for your first 24 hours, that kind of thing gets the walk of shame, they call it in some meetings where I live. It's a bad thing, but there's something about that honesty and integrity that's important for you to do that. And I've had clients that kind of wanted to skip over that and just ignore the day count, and that's the first kind of chip away, I think, at integrity when they start to do that. So, but you mentioned some other things that really need, I think, to be addressed first, and that's some of the stuff that you're doing again. You've been comfortable, you say, with porn and masturbation and fantasy, and we're all experiencing the boredom, stress, and depression, and I understand the need to do something with that, but you're kind of slipping back into your addictive behavior. And I think I would really, I know you've tried it, there's a lot of stuff going on here. I think I'd really kind of make it very simple right now and focus on your recovery and the basic bottom line behaviors, and really focus on that for, say, 90 days of just basic program, working at getting the tools, looking at powerlessness, your elements of surrender, managing triggers and cravings, learning how to control feelings, that basic kind of skills that are really essential in the first phase of sex addiction recovery. And then I think I would start to add, I don't know what well, I'll just say EMDR, I'm an EMDR practitioner. That's a fabulous therapy for trauma, really important. one. However, if we start, this is just my feeling, if we start trauma work too soon, before somebody's really able to manage the feelings that come up, there's a lot of strong feelings and thoughts. And if we start digging in, and by we, I mean therapists, too soon, it can be problematic for people. And I've seen clients relapse over just starting too much work too soon, as opposed to getting a really strong foundation in place. So I'd really kind of pull back from the addictive behaviors, go back, keep it really simple with your basic program and stick to it for a while and keep it really simple, because that's going to be what's going to pull you through. And just really, you know, I don't know how connected you are. There's a lot of therapy activities here, but I think probably the single biggest protective factor you can do is have a really strong social support network, a sponsor, good friends, people that are you're accountable to, kind of a group of other men, I assume you're a man, who you can go to meetings with and be accountable to and have some fellowship with, and really start to connect, because those guys are the ones that are going to be really a major healing force for you.
Yeah, whenever we get a question like this, my immediate thought is back to basics. You know, install Nanny or Custodio or Covenant Eyes on your phone and your laptop and your tablet, and you don't have the password. Your sponsor has the password, not you. Your sponsor does the settings, not you. Your sponsor gets a report about what you've been doing. Create some accountability that way. That'll help with porn. It won't prevent you from using porn, but it'll help. You know, early in recovery for me, I didn't sleep at my own house for a couple of months when I was really struggling. I went and slept on a different person's couch every night. I just said, hey, everybody, you know, I'm not broke. I don't need a place to stay. What I need is somebody, I need to be away from my house at night, because that's when I act out. And, you know, if I can sleep on somebody's couch tonight and somebody else's tomorrow, I'll try not to be a burden. I swear I'll clean up, you know, that kind of thing. And I did that for a couple of months, and it really helped, that kind of accountability. And I also made some really good friends. You know, I'd sit down and we'd have dinner together and we'd watch TV and hang out and talk about recovery and talk about life. And, you know, I got to know some people. It was really incredible. It was a little bit about what David talked about with empathy earlier. You know, when you're sleeping on somebody's couch, you damn well better show some interest in them. So I did. And I kind of learned how to reconnect with people through that. I would also suggest double up your meetings. I had a period in sobriety where I was unemployed for longer than I care to think about. And instead of going to 3 meetings a week, I was going to 2 meetings a day. And it helped me stay sober. And I talked about my feelings and, you know, what was going on, and I stayed sober through that. You know, one day at a time. You know, people would remind me, you know, it's just about today. You know, today you have a place to live, you have food, and there are plenty of recovery meetings, and we're here for you. Life is good. And they would remind me today. And break it down into smaller chunks, morning, noon, and night. If you've got a sponsor, if you don't have a sponsor, get one, because now is the time when you're struggling to stay sober. If you do, come clean and say, look, I'm really struggling. I'm still struggling with porn and masturbation and fantasy as coping mechanisms, which is key for addiction. When we use these things to cope, it's addiction. You feel boredom, you feel stress, you feel depressed. Understandable. There are better coping mechanisms, and you're using some of them, reading books, going to meetings, but check in with your sponsor first thing in the morning and commit that I'm going to call you at noon. It'll be a 30-second call, but at noon, I'm going to say, I didn't look at porn, I didn't masturbate, I'm sober. And then at noon, you say, I'm going to call you right before I go to bed at 10:20 p.m. or whatever time that is acceptable to your sponsor. And I'm going to commit to you that between now and 11 p.m., I'm not going to act out. And then you call at 11 and say, I didn't act out. I'll call you at 7:30 when we both wake up, and I promise I'm not going to act out between now and 7:30. Just take it in really discrete chunks. I know people in AA who call their sponsor every hour on the hour, when they're really struggling. That would make me a little crazy. But, you know, 3 times a day, you know, morning, noon, and night, there's nothing wrong with that. And if, you know, if your sponsor can't take those calls, find a friend in recovery who's also struggling, and you can help each other stay sober. David really hit it. It's all about not doing this on your own. And I love that you're here, and I love that you're asking the question, but, you know, you need more than David and I 1 hour a week. You need people in your life on a regular basis.
The other thing I'll throw out there, and it's harder these days, but to really get out of yourself, if you don't have a job to go to, service of some kind, you know, doing something. There's so much need right now. I think just to go out and connect with people in a giving way, in a selfless way, is really can be very healing. Just to kind of get out of our own misery and go out and really help somebody else makes us feel good. A little shot of dopamine when you most need it. So yeah.
Yeah, one more quick one here before we log out. My husband, the addict, is not comfortable getting a sponsor from Zoom meetings. And I've heard this several times. So thoughts on that, David?
Zoom is awkward. It's always uncomfortable. You don't really know people. It's kind of not quite three-dimensional. But I think the need for a sponsor so outweighs the awkwardness of the medium that I think it's really important. So I'd really encourage you to push through whatever that discomfort is and talk about it. But I think the idea of sponsorship is incredibly important.
And sometimes in situations like that, particularly, you know, when people are resistant to getting a sponsor, they think they're going to be stuck with that person forever. And that's not how sponsorship works. So encourage him to say, hey, I just need a temporary sponsor to get me through the pandemic, and then I'll find a real world sponsor at an actual meeting. Is there anybody who can give me, you know, a couple of months or something? And that's a lot easier because it's usually the addict, not the sponsor, who feels uncomfortable.
Right.
You know, and either we're just uncomfortable asking for anything because we're addicts and we don't meet our needs, we avoid our needs, or we're just afraid that we're going to be stuck with the wrong person forever. This is not a marriage, and I'm not saying that your husband is stuck with you know, you're here, you're supporting. It's probably a good thing, but you know, this doesn't last forever. Sponsorship walks you through a period, and then you get a different sponsor. I mean, some people stay sponsors for 30 years, but I mean, I tell my people they have to move on after we get through the steps. That's what I do with my sponsees. I say, okay, you're ready for someone else now. I don't do day-to-day maintenance. I get you through the steps.
And you don't want to, I mean, to don't spend time looking for the perfect sponsor either. There's just a sponsor is, like Scott said, it's you know, we don't be changing them every day or every week, but people change sponsors. That's part of the progress, I think.
Yeah, for both the sponsee and the sponsor. So yeah, maybe try just throwing out, what about a temporary sponsor? Just some random temporary person that you can call once a day and get some advice from. That should be, yeah. So we're out of time. David, thank you so much. Empathy is always, there's in the comments, wait a minute, you're unemployed and homeless and we're taking advice from you. Yeah, I was. But life is good now. So yeah, everybody, we'll be back next week. Empathy is a great topic, David. Thank you.
Just please, everybody take care of yourselves and each other.
So we'll see you next Wednesday.
Take care. Bye.